Really pleased to be joined by a journalist who I've been reading for a really, really long time, who I think has become one of the great chroniclers of New York City, Jonathan Mahler. His new book is called The Gods of New York: Egotists, Idealists, Opportunists, and the Birth of the Modern City, 1986 to 1990. Jonathan, I thought I would just start with a really broad question, probably one you've been asked in some form or another before, which is when you think about the politics of New York in the period that you're writing about in the late 1980s, and the politics, when I think it would have been really inconceivable to imagine a Muslim candidate seriously contending for mayor, an anti-Zionist candidate seriously contending for mayor, openly socialist candidate. When you step back, how do you make sense of this dramatic political transition that we've seen in your and my adult lifetimes in the politics of New York City?
Yeah, actually, you framed the question a little bit differently. I get versions of that question.
Okay.
I mean, the way I kind of like to think about it is my book, which covers 86 to 90, beginning with Koch's reelection to his what would be his third and final term, and then ending with him losing to Dinkins. I mean, him losing ultimately, Rudy losing to Dinkins in the general, but Koch in the primary. I think about that as being sort of the beginning of a kind of a chapter in the life of New York City, which is essentially that, in the kind of the post-World War II era, New York was like the great working class city with all sorts of, diverse shipping and manufacturing, powerful labor unions. All that basically gets hollowed out over the course of the 60s and 70s with deindustrialization, and then companies start moving out of New York. There's kind of nothing left in the 70s. The city bottoms out. Then in the 80s, it kind of is reborn in a sense, though you can kind of put that rebirth in air quotes, because it was a rebirth that obviously left a lot of people out. It was a kind of a reorientation of the working class economy around Wall Street and finance and real estate. And so the Koch years are really those years. That is the rebirth of New York. I mean, I guess, you could say that the neoliberal rebirth of New York. I think what we're seeing now is the backlash really against that finally coming to like full fruition. So I think we had a glimpse of it with de Blasio, of course, but de Blasio was kind of accidentally elected mayor. He had no real kind of movement behind him. Mamdani clearly does. And I think that movement is really in many ways the culmination of the widening wealth gap and affordability crisis that sort of starts in 1980s New York, that starts in this kind of, what's thought of as this kind of great era for New York, the booming Wall Street, the skyscrapers. But I think what we're seeing now is really kind of an answer to that, a response to it.
Interestingly, first, though, you have this move to a kind of law and order, more conservative politics, right, with the long Giuliani era.
Yeah.
Why do you think that? Is it because you think that the problems of affordability hadn't reached those kind of the levels at that point they had? Or why was that? Do you think that the early phase of this new kind of Wall Street, more economically unequal New York produces a move to the right, and then the center with Bloomberg, and then the left now with Mamdani?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when Dinkins gets elected in 89, it's an incredibly narrow victory. I mean, the city was basically evenly divided between Giuliani and Dinkins. Certainly in 93, when Giuliani gets elected, there's a huge focus on crime in that campaign, even though crime had already peaked. It had peaked in 90, 91. By 93, it was already kind of on its way down. But still, that was the shift. I think that what happens later, I think, is, I guess one way to think about it is like, Bloomberg really kind of named it, right? When he called New York a luxury product.
Yes.
So I guess I feel like what happened is, in the 90s, there really was a backlash against crime. And the crime, there was no question, the crime reached kind of historic levels in New York at the end of the 80s and into the early 90s. I think once that issue receded, then the affordability issues could kind of move to the fore again. And I think another really important thing that's happening now that we've seen with the Mamdani campaign is, his base is people who are earning, $140,000 a year or so, and who can't make that kind of life they want for themselves in New York. And, back in the 80s,
Mhm.
It's the very people who are now in industries like, well, media or marketing or advertising, all these industries that were in many ways kind of born in the 80s. The people who were yuppies in the 1980s, basically, who were young urban professional and upwardly mobile, are
Mhm.
now really struggling to make a life in New York. So I think that if you want to think about, well, what, in broad terms, kind of what happened, I mean, I think
Mhm.
one of the big things that happened is that class of white collar
Mhm.
workers
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
were benefiting so much from this rebirth of New York, this reorientation of New York's economy in the 80s, are now finding it impossible to stay here and to live here. I mean, that is a function of the fact that the super wealthy have become so wealthy that real estate has become something that's totally inaccessible to people who aren't really wealthy or don't have some kind of inherited wealth. And so this class of people who all went to college and all have white collar jobs are frustrated because they're not able to afford the city any longer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's this segment of New Yorkers who are very, very frightened of Mamdani. And, Shaul Magid wrote this piece that I thought was very interesting, where he was kind of wondering whether the tremendous anxiety among some New York Jews, and particularly kind of institutional Jewish leadership, about Mamdani represents something not so much only about Mamdani, but the sense that the city is undergoing a transition, demographic transition, right? And it's not the kind of Jewish city that it used to be, right? Where you just kind of expected that lots of the politicians were Jewish. But as this, immigrant successions have happened in New York for a century or more, you now have more Muslim, more South Asian New Yorkers, and they're producing. So, to what degree does it make sense to see Mamdani as just part of a historical New York succession of different immigrant groups coming and putting their stamp on the city?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's a very good point. I mean, I do think that he does reflect a real, what has been a kind of an ongoing demographic shift, which in and of itself really started decades ago. I mean, it started in the 80s too, in fact, that kind of second wave of immigration we had in the early 20th century, of course, all the kind of Jewish immigrants coming to New York. And then beginning in the 70s and 80s and continuing on, we had a whole new wave of immigrants from Asia, from Africa, from the Caribbean. And yeah, he's very much part of that new wave. And, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of this is obviously about power. And I think that there's a sense among the business class in New York and the kind of real estate community, maybe in particular, that they've really had the reins of power in New York really since the fiscal crisis. The fiscal crisis,
In the
which
70s.
in the 70s, yeah, which there's a great documentary about it out now that if you get a chance to see it, it's really I recommend it. It's called Drop Dead City. It's actually a lot of fun and it's also really instructive. But the city in the 70s came to the brink of bankruptcy because it was basically running on fumes. Its economy was hollowing out, and yet it was still paying to maintain its whole infrastructure, keeping all these union employees, employed, et cetera. And then, the city kind of renegotiates its deal with the financial community. And ever since then, New York has really been beholden to the business community. It was all tax breaks, it was zoning waivers, it was up to the private, it was the wealthy who were subsidizing the tax base increasingly. And so, I think that there's a real sense of anxiety inside the business class as well, which is that, Mamdani is at least talking really about stripping away from them some of this power that they've held for decades. And they see themselves as critical to the survival of the city, which in some sense is true. I mean, but in other sense is probably overstated.
Right. But do you think that Mamdani, as mayor of New York, has the power to change that structural dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I think he has to try because I think that's what he's promising to do. And I think that there are going to be a lot of limitations. I mean, he can't raise taxes. And he can freeze the rent once he changes the composition of the board that controls the rent stabilized apartments. But he will first need to do that. And he's going to need money to do the things he wants to do. And that's going to require more taxes. And that's something he's going to have to convince Kathy Hochul of. So, I don't know. But I don't think he can have just a normal, moderate, like I think he's talking in a very ambitious way about how the city needs to change. And I think that's going to require a lot of disruption. And he's going to have to find a way to do it, I think.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.